Roger Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. Welcome to this, our regular series, Trump's Trade War. Each and every day, we're bringing you the analysis and insights of The Hub's best contributors on this incredible moment that Canada finds itself in, facing off against the threat of large-scale tariffs from the United States and from President Trump. Exceedingly fortunate to have back on the program the Alberta Council's economist and thinker and writer for The Hub, Alicia Planenchik. Thank you, Alicia, for coming on the program today.
Always a pleasure.
Let's go through your article that you wrote for The Hub. It's on our trade, let's call it dependency with the United States, that there are a lot of talk right now about trade diversification. And according to some of the numbers you've pulled, this is going to be challenging to say the least. So let's look at the first graph in your article and unpack this for us. What are we looking at?
Yeah, I mean, just to start from the top and maybe state the obvious a little bit is that Canada is extremely reliant on the US to buy our exports, right? And just the stat that many folks will have heard is that almost 3/4 of our exports that are sold globally are purchased by the US. You know, that's one of those numbers that when times are good, nobody bats an eye because that is a lot of dollars and revenue coming into our businesses. And it's a really good thing to be close to, you know, a big powerhouse economy. But when the trade relationship gets a little bit icy as it is today, it kind of brings back this renewed conversation that has been a thing for a while, this question of diversification and other trade partners. So our interest with the most recent Econ Minute was just to see, you know, has there been any progress over the last couple of decades to, you know, look to those other markets beyond the US? And the short answer, unfortunately, was no. The way that we looked at it was, you know, instead of just looking at the top line number, we wanted to look at individual exports. So of Canada's top product exports, how reliant are they on the US market, right? Is this just a story about crude oil, or is it basically everything, all of our key exports are reliant on the US market? And unfortunately, it's mostly the latter, right? Most of our exports, our major exports, really rely on the US for sales, to the extent that I think it was 17 out of the top 25 that we looked at. More than 60% of their revenue comes from the US. And for 8 of those, it was almost 90% or more.
Yeah, let's go to that list now because it is impressive to go through this and look at export by category. Huge list here, Alicia. You know, we see these numbers up in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s. By the time we're getting towards the bottom of the list, we're still, you know, up in the 50s and 60s. So is this a representation then of just the predominance of US-Canada trade across all these different diverse sectors, way more than just energy? That seems to be the story here.
For sure. This is way more than just an energy story. I think that's kind of, for me, the big takeaway from this Econ Minute is it's really across most of our important products that we export. You know, the US is our major buyer. This is really a case of having all of our eggs in one basket across products. And the other thing that was unfortunate to see is that there hasn't been a lot of change, even in these individual product categories over the last couple of decades. Most of them have continued to rely on the US market just as much as they did, you know, 10 or 20 years ago.
Wow. So there was I guess, a good story in your Econ Minute on the hub.ca right now about mining, that some sectors have actually shown an ability to diversify away from the US. Do we know what brought that about? What caused a sector like mining to have, you know, success when all these other sectors on that big list of yours are clearly struggling with diversification?
Yeah, I don't know too much behind it. It definitely seemed to be a lot of growth in Asian markets, in particular China, that drove that. But I think the encouraging thing to see, and why I would call those two a success story, is it wasn't just that they stopped selling to the US or sold less to the US, they really increased their overall exports, right? So diversification is really only successful if you also sell more product, right? More value. There are lots of ways that we could diversify away from the US. One is just cutting off trade. And I would argue that's a really, really terrible idea. And so again, looking at these couple of products shows, though, that they did successfully do that, where they not only shifted to other markets, they net overall grew their sales quite a lot, sixfold in the case of a couple of these products.
Wow. And does that give us some hope here, let's say, for oil and gas, that if we could build more pipelines, if Canada East, let's say, a pipeline from, the oil sands through to tidewater on some part of our Atlantic coast, are those the types of steps that maybe could see an energy industry like the one we have in Canada that's very dependent on the U.S. right now follow maybe the example of some of these parts of the mining sector in Canada that have been able to achieve that diversification, and as you say, increase the total sales that they're achieving. So not only are they getting out of reliance on the United States, they're selling more to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great point. I think, especially from federal government, we've heard so much about trade agreements and relationships nationally. And I think that really misses the point where what we need to really reach other markets is that trade infrastructure in place. And so pipelines is a huge one, but even more broadly is just roads and rail and port infrastructure. I saw a stat recently that blew my mind, which was that 90% of Canadians view our trade infrastructure as being in bad shape. And businesses in particular will tell you that it has deteriorated significantly in recent years. So having those sort of fundamental pieces in place to actually get product to market is huge, and I think should be a really big conversation happening, not just over the next, however many days until we hear new news from President Trump, but hopefully longer term.
Final question. If we go back to this chart of yours that shows the reliance on the U.S. market from 2004 to 2024, there were some dips there, maybe around the financial crisis. But, since from 2020 through to 2024, we're less diversified vis-a-vis the United States. This will take a long time, won't it, Alicia? For those of us maybe who are hoping that this tariff threat in the short term can be headed off through trade diversification, I think what your chart tells me is that, this is a goal and aspiration that we should have, but it's not a panacea for the current predicament we find ourselves in.
Absolutely. I think, honestly, the biggest takeaway for me in the short term from this data is just how reliant we are on this trade relationship and on it working. That really needs to be kind of the number one short-term goal. Long term, let's look to other markets and grow our exports overall. That's great. But short term is really mending this relationship with the U.S. because that is a huge driver of our wealth in Canada.
Yeah, well, let's end with a quote that we have from you on our quote board today. Canada's economy remains firmly hitched to America's. You've certainly shown that in your data on the hub.ca. We urge our viewers to check it out right now. Terrific article to download and get up to speed on. Alicia, thanks so much for all the work you're doing at the Business Council of Alberta and for coming on the program today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, that wraps up today's edition of Trump's Trade War. We're going to be here with you every day with hopefully insightful videos like the one we've just provided, giving you with some new analysis and insights on this fast-changing issue. Thanks for watching. Back to you shortly with more videos. Until then, bye-bye.